So, let's see, meeting. There, okay. So, picking up from last time, Hoover had no chance of getting reelected in 1932, but the Democrats, or maybe as a result, because his defeat was foreordained, the Democrats refused to offer any kind of alternatives to what he was doing. On the contrary, Roosevelt ran for president, emphasizing the importance of balanced budgets and conservative fiscal policy. And he even went so far as to criticize Hoover for excessive spending. Roosevelt, during the election, did speak of a New Deal for Americans, but he never, ever said anything concrete about what that New Deal might be. He was assuming he was going to win, and in his case, it was the only assumption that anyone intelligent could make. And he didn't want to say anything that could get anybody upset with him. He did suggest that programs to aid the poor would have priority over lending money or giving money to businesses. Hoover was 100% opposed to the federal government assisting individuals. He believed that all assistance from the federal government should be to large-scale institutions. It should be systemic. Whereas the Democrats had been on record that given the high rate of personal suffering, the federal government had to get involved in ameliorating the pain that people were facing. But even on that issue, he was unclear about what he was going to do. And it's clear as well, from a historical point of view, that there was no secret master plan even that Roosevelt came into office with. Partly because while he knew the situation was bad, he, like most other people in positions of responsibility, did not comprehend how bad it actually was and how much worse it was going to get. So he thought the United States is still the wealthiest country in the world. We've still got the highest paid people in the world. We've still got the best factories in the world. We're going through this blip and we're going to get through it and everything will go back to being the way it was. But after he was elected, having won almost 58% of the vote, he came, as he began to look at the situation, it became clearer to him and his advisors how actually desperate the situation was, how the banks started failing in large numbers after the election, the fiscal system seemed to be collapsing right in front of everybody's eyes. And Roosevelt was not to be inaugurated until March 4th. And during the 4 months between the November election and the inaugural, these were the worst months of the Depression. Before the election, unemployment was at about 25%. By the end of 1932, it had shot up to 40%. In a matter of a couple of months, the country, jobs were disappearing and the value of money was disappearing. Hardship increased dramatically, and Hoover, who was still in the White House, felt powerless to do anything. And Roosevelt continued to refuse to say exactly what he was going to do, or not even exactly. He was assembling his cabinet and a brain trust that provided him with increasingly sobering assessments of what was wrong. So the New Deal that was unveiled after March 4th was largely improvised and involved a set of emergency responses to a crisis that kept getting bigger and bigger. So, in his inaugural address on March 4th, 1933, Roosevelt stressed the possibilities for hope. He said, this in his inaugural address, he said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, one of his most famous lines. And it has remained the single most famous line of his presidency. On some levels, his inaugural speech and even that very line was not so different from Hoover's insistence that the Depression was a test and that character and courage were required to pull out of it. The big difference was that FDR acknowledged that people were afraid, that they had good reason to be afraid, that courage and character were not going to be enough, and that the government needed to address the hurt that people were experiencing if fear were to be overcome and confidence to be restored. So Roosevelt, from the beginning, said a top priority was to help the people who were desperate, not just businesses. Though, of course, at the same time, he and his advisors were thinking about the systematic problems that underlie the Depression. Before we get, and the proposals they developed rested on their assessment of what the causes were for the Depression. But before we get into the more details of the New Deal, I think it's important I put this up because these figures underscore a trend that was occurring in the United States, which was the centralization of government and the centralization of the economy. But I think they also underscore that the centralization, while continuing during the New Deal, really doesn't take place until after 1940. That is, it has to be associated with the U.S. entry into World War II, at which point the importance of the federal government becomes overwhelming. So even in 1940, at the beginning of 1940, state and local governments still are overwhelmingly responsible for most government expenditures. They are providing the basic experience of government that most citizens have. The New Deal has significantly increased federal spending, but it's still the smallest. But by 1950, even after the war is over, the federal government has become and has remained since then the dominant feature of government. At the same time, if we look at the Fortune 400 companies as a percentage of gross domestic product, they represent less than a third in the 20s and 30s. After the experience of the war, they're almost 3/4, more than 2/3, not quite 3/4 of gross domestic product. By 1960, they're 75%. By 1970, an amazing 93%. The centralization of the United States is a revolution. And oftentimes, last time one of you guys asked, where did Roosevelt get his reputation for being a big spender? And I think this is actually where he gets his reputation. The reputation had less to do with the New Deal programs than with the tremendous reorganization of national life that occurs in the 1940s, of which Roosevelt was the first president to preside over this centralization of life. Now, Roosevelt approached the problem of the Depression with the conviction that principle should never stand in the way of addressing problems, and that opportunism was always the best policy. That if you tried to be consistent, you would fail, you would be destroyed. His administration consisted of men and a handful of women, including Frances Perkins, who was Secretary of Labor and the first woman ever appointed to the cabinet, who disagreed on pretty much every issue you could think of, every issue that presented itself to them. So whenever the cabinet got together to discuss the problems, they presented him they were arguing with each other, and they presented him with contradictory recommendations. But it wasn't simply his cabinet, it was his White House staff, consisted of people with very different perspectives and very different backgrounds. And Roosevelt took in all this information, these recommendations. He would assess the politics of every single situation and then come down as to what he thought would be the best thing to do. And often the best thing to do was not the ideal thing to do, but the thing that he knew could get done. So it might be not even the second best thing. It might be the 10th or the 20th best thing. But it was something that would be better than nothing. And he also dealt with the reality that there were limited resources. So he couldn't do everything he wanted to do, even if Congress would allow him to. So the dilemma of how to balance economic stimulus and popular relief contributed to the New Deal being a somewhat confused collection of policies, programs, and preferences. You should take a look at the Polenberg book, because he does a very good job of outlining these various programs and organizing them in terms of the problems they were trying to address, some of the political problems that each program also involved. But there's no way that you can synthesize this into a clear-cut set of principles that the New Deal was about X, Y, and Z. The New Deal was, by its very nature, opportunistic and improvisatory, a set of experiments. And it was also affected by the fragile nature of the New Deal coalition, of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party rested on two foundations: urban ethnic voters, largely Catholic and Jewish, but not exclusively, in the North, Midwest, and the Far West, and Southern Democrats. And they had very different sets of problems, and they had very different expectations of what should be done. The New Deal, the White House had to promise Southern Democrats that under no circumstances would the New Deal be allowed to interfere with segregation, with Jim Crow. So they had to promise that administration of the programs would always be local and would respect community values.